Good evening and a warm welcome to each of you, whether you are present tonight or listening to tonight's recording when convenient. My name is Maria Pascuzzi, the Director of Spirit Alive, a ministry supported by my congregation, the Sisters of St. Joseph of Brentwood, New York. Please allow me to begin with a few announcements. First, tonight's presentation is being recorded and within approximately 72 hours will be posted on the Spirit Alive YouTube channel, along with all of our other recorded presentations. Feel free to listen again and know that if you have a conflict and can't be present for one of our AI webinars or a mini course, you can always view the recording, but please be patient. It takes our tech a little bit of time to get that posted for you. Also, if you have questions, you can submit them throughout the presentation by typing them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. At the end of the presentation, our presenter will answer as many questions as possible. Every day, from the time we wake up until the time we go to bed to go back to sleep, AI is quietly working behind the scenes to make our daily experiences smoother, smarter, and less stressful. Alexa and Siri, if you are lucky enough to have either, function as personal assistants. AI is behind the personalized content recommendations that come in on our phones to guide our choices or to tempt us. It manages our calendars. It creates appointments. It sends schedule reminders so we never forget where we are supposed to be, nor can we have an excuse for not being there. There's no need anymore to consult an atlas or a street map to find the best travel route, and no more printing out a Google map to read as we drive. Most of us now rely on AI-generated apps like Waze that tell us when to leave, the quickest way to get there. Waze gives us real-time traffic updates and reroutes us in cases of slowdowns or accidents. It's all great, and sometimes I wonder how we could ever live without the advances and conveniences that AI has made possible. But widespread rapid development and deployment of powerful generative AI models come with enormous environmental consequences. To understand the impact of AI on our environment and to consider what can be done to mitigate environmental damage, we are fortunate tonight to have with us Professor Christiane Zenner, an expert in environmental ethics. Dr. Zenner completed a BA in human biology at Stanford University and then an MA and a PhD in religious studies from Yale Divinity School and Yale University, respectively. She is an associate professor of theology, science, and ethics in environmental studies and in the Department of Theology at Fordham University, where she is an affiliated faculty member in environmental studies and American studies. Her research into emerging and established freshwater ethics intersects with ecological theory, religious ecologies, developments in earth science, and the ecological turn in Catholic social teaching. In all of her work, she strives to grapple with the deep patterns, both conceptual and institutional, that shape perception of cultural religious moralities and frames of ecological ethical perception. She strives to demonstrate rigorous and responsible multidisciplinary approaches to contemporary eco-social realities, and she strives to articulate constructive intersectional feminist pathways forward. Professor Zenner is the author of 3 monographs. I believe she's working on 2 more on the way, is the co-editor of 2 more volumes, and has published over 20 peer-reviewed articles in scholarly journals. Christiane is on sabbatical this year, and as you know, that's precious time to dedicate to her research and writing. And in fact, in just a few days, she'll be leaving for Dublin to be a visiting professor at Trinity in Dublin. So we are especially grateful that she has taken time to prepare for tonight's webinar and share her knowledge and her expertise with us all. So, welcome, Christiana. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Sister Maria. Thank you for having me, and thank you to everyone for being here as well. We do have a PowerPoint that will be accompanying the uh, lecture and then our Q&A subsequently. So excellent. Thank you so much. AI and environment is an enormous topic, and I will say at the outset that I take this in the spirit of ecology broadly understood, which is a dynamic understanding of ecosystems, of biota, flora, fauna, minerals, plants, all of the intersecting parts that constitute ecosystems and different modes of relationship, and that includes humans as well. So you will hear in this presentation aspects about AI and environment, as well as AI and society, and eco-social is the term that I often use to anchor those together. I want to begin by acknowledging that our ability to be here tonight is facilitated by technology, by the data centers, cloud computing, um, internet, and all the different types of devices that we are using in order to be present remotely with one another. Currently, I'm coming to you from modern day Canada, and Canada, as many of you know, has a different kind of relationship with First Nations as a government than the United States does, where I am a professor in New York City. The original protectors of the land were the Lenape peoples. And so I invite you to think about where you are, both physically and also then where the data centers may be that are facilitating your connection tonight. I also want to thank especially the Spirit Alive team, Sister Maria particularly, and Matthew Mobijan, who has been a stupendous tech support as we encountered some difficulties with our tech trial and my computer last week. And also, of course, the Sisters of St. Joseph of Brentwood, who have not only been visionary in enabling and facilitating this series, but also in doing a range of eco-social charisms in a way that has predated Laudato Si'. And I'll say more about that a little while later. It was lovely to see the video, the photographs and summaries of the previous talks in the series. And I'm really honored and in some ways delighted to be the second to last presenter because I think that there are many strands of the conversations from Dr. Hertzfeld, Dr. Schertz, and many others that will have salience today. So one of the things I just like to invite those of you in attendance to do as we get going is to take a moment, I'll give like 20 seconds, and just jot down or think about the ways that you use AI, whether intentionally in the sense of committing the explicit summoning of AI in your life, or perhaps in some of the more I suppose we might say now more passive or given ways that Sister Maria described at the outset. And in particular, using generative AI is what I'm interested in. So we'll take about 15, 20 seconds for that. Just jot them down wherever. One of the reasons I invite us to do this is that I think it's a way of grounding a conversation that can sometimes feel very highly conceptualized and thus ungrounded. But as several of the previous presenters have pointed out, and as we'll certainly be talking about tonight, there are very specific place-based infrastructural realities with highly racialized dimensions that are deeply embedded in the socioeconomic and political economic processes of our nation and the world at large. And so thinking about the dynamic interplay between the daily uses, or as scholars like to say, the use cases, in which you find yourself engaging generative AI, And then those broader dynamics is a useful way to help you think about your own points of engagement, intentionality, and eventually perhaps levers of influence that you may choose to press. We can talk about this a bit more in the Q&A, but I do a similar exercise with students at the start of every semester since ChatGPT was released, especially. And I say, listen, there's no right answer, there's no wrong answer. Nothing is, well, you need to be appropriate. Some things are disallowed. But tell me and tell each other anonymously on a shared Google document, how to use AI. How does it show up in your life? And let me tell you, the answers are so many. Everything from recipes to cultivate describing particular kinds of workouts. Some of my students use generative AI to help them in dating app conversations. This is actually a really big thing um, for across age brackets. And so there are also different ways in different classes that I teach that students choose to regard the use of generative AI in the classroom. And this is one of the conversations that I strive to facilitate with and for them, is to come to some kind of social contract about how we in the classroom, they in particular, will or will not use generative AI and why. So I invite you to consider something similar as you move not only through this presentation tonight, but also in conversations with the presentations that have preceded. So we have three main parts of today's presentation. First is social impacts and considerations, and I'll go through that with some, if not brevity, then just a little more summary than others. Though I'll do some framing as well based on Catholic social teaching. Second, we'll be focusing especially on ecological impacts and considerations, given the topic of the day. And then thirdly, I'll conclude with some constructive ethical directions. Those tend both towards the academic and ethically principled and get really into the nitty-gritty in certain ways. They also offer some very practical considerations to go forward. And then after that, of course, we'll do Q&A. But first, the Super Bowl. So, obviously, this is a highly watched phenomenon, not just the Super Bowl, but especially this year, Bad Bunny's halftime show, and of course, the Super Bowl ads. Now, I confess to being, if not shocked, then a little surprised by the prevalence of generative AI ads. And so I include one here, Alexa Plus, and it was featured in an ad by Chris Hemsworth, Australian actor Chris Hemsworth, and his spouse. And for those of you who saw it, you'll know that it was a really extreme example of what we might call hype and hyperbole. So it features Hemsworth's spouse being just going about her daily life and using AI and being like, yeah, this is totally reasonable. This helps me plan my life. I've got three kids. We can do this, babe. And he is like, well, I think the AI is actually trying to kill me. And so it's these, absurdist scenarios that are giving an extreme case of why a person might be nervous about AI. And of course, the effect in the ad is to have the viewer dismiss it and be like, oh my gosh, that's so funny. That's so absurd. That would never happen. Okay, great. I found the ad less enthralling than Vanity Fair Australia did. I found it frustrating as an ethicist because the major issues with AI as I see them are not necessarily about whether Alexa is going to go rogue on us, though that's a, reasonable question to ask, and especially in downstream conversations about AI consciousness and so forth. But to me, the real questions are about the subtitle of this talk, which is hidden costs and inequalities. In other words, the infrastructure upon which generative AI is predicated, who benefits, who bears the burdens, and how is it built in ways that disenfranchise various sectors of society, degrade human dignity, and certainly degrade the environment. So again, this then is the first Roman numeral social considerations. And I've listed a whole bunch here. All right, so I'm not going to go through all of them, but this hopefully will be a list that you recognize again from previous webinars in the series, but also perhaps from conversations and articles you may have read elsewhere. So there are real social concerns, not just considerations, but social concerns about automation, jobs, and the effect on the economy. The United States government, as well as major corporations like Amazon and Nvidia, and of course many others, Anthropic, OpenAI, are investing massive amounts of money in AI in the hope that it will generate massive profits. To whom do those profits accrue? Well, that's generally already to the billionaires or the shareholders, not to the everyday people. So immediately the question about automation and AI and investment and society also becomes a question about social inequality and, as I see it at least, the enshrining of certain patterns that are arguably rather problematic. There are also real concerns about data and privacy. Data mining, both in terms of artistic works, literary works, online information, is substantial. It's also very, very substantial in terms of privacy concerns, especially, not only, but especially for children in contexts where ed tech is trying to enter into educational systems and then has all this access to the information about how children are using the internet and data about their lives and so forth. Um, I'm sure that many of you have heard about the really awful and tragic dynamic of generative AI coaching people or encouraging people towards suicide. I'm not going to talk about that extensively in this talk, but I want to name that that is real and that is obviously a problem. Then I want to name that there are very real patterns of racial and gender bias being um, written into generative AI by the large language learning models because of the ways that information and the knowledge economy and data gathering often replicate the biases of a given society. So there's a lot to say about that, a whole nother topic, but I would recommend especially the work of doctors Ruha Benjamin, who's at Princeton, and Abeba Berhani, who is at the AI Accountability Lab at Trinity College, Dublin. Um, at the end of these slides, incidentally, I also have an extensive list of recommendations and references of folks that I've named in the talk, as well as additional ones. So please feel free to request that or check out the YouTube version of this talk later. There are questions about AI and education. A lot of folks are excited about and hyping the ways that generative AI may assist educational aims. And this is a very important conversation to have because there is also a lot of concern about generative AI coming into schools through generally untested kinds of programs that promise great outcomes and yet have no method of accountability or any kind of proof of concept demonstrations and don't necessarily meet the needs of teachers and students. So, where I live in New York City, I want to lift up especially the work of Dr. Kelly Clancy, who's a political scientist and editor, and an organization she runs called PACES, Parents for AI Caution in Educational Spaces. I will say more about caution about AI, and that's, the fancy term for that is the precautionary principle. But much of what we see in the for-profit, including education, ed tech companies and others, is a kind of manufactured demand. The idea that AI is inevitable and therefore we've got to figure out ways to use it. And so therefore let's backfill and create programs that teachers will need to use. Those do not necessarily suit what teachers need. So there's lots of bigger conversations. Dr. Clancy and I have been in conversation in person about this in a number of venues that you can find online, but I would recommend her work on that. And then finally, there are real questions about relationality. Those of you who saw Dr. Noreen Hertzfeld's talk will obviously have a particular kind of conceptual apparatus for reflecting on that. In addition, I would commend to you an article in an op-ed in The Guardian that Rebecca Solnit wrote about 10 days ago. And it's reflecting on what technology, especially generative AI, takes from us. And that is, in short, an ability not just to relate to one another unmediated, but it also creates humans as competition for the generative AI, the data gathering, the time. It creates an economy in which attention is the commodity and other humans, time with other human beings, the aims of human-centered education, human-centered time, quality social interaction in person are secondary to the goals of screen time, essentially. And so this becomes then a question not just about how capitalism and corporate incentivization and social media work. It also becomes a question, as do many of these things, about the virtues that we want to cultivate as humans, as educators, and as social beings. All right. Now, just in case all of that sounds really negative on AI, and sure, some of it is. I'm a skeptic. What can I say? Um, I need to point out that technology can be utterly fantastic. And I am, in many respects, also a big fan. And here I do very much tend to agree with a lot of Catholic teaching on technology. And technology in Catholic theology, as well as Catholic social teaching, is seen as a proper power of human beings. That technology is a wonderful and fantastic and often empowering expression of human creativity that derives from an understanding of humans as created by God and endowed with these remarkable brains and perceptual abilities. And it's also part of larger discourses on theology and science. So, technology, yes, but technology, the Catholic Church has also come to articulate, is also only as good as the ethical framework within which it is deployed and the goals of the use of technology, and not just the goals in some abstract sense, right? Like we all want to improve education, I hope. We all want to mitigate negative environmental impacts, I hope. But at the same time, it's a practical question, like how does it look? How is it implemented? And so there's been a lot of comparisons you may have noticed between this AI revolution that we are in at the moment and the Industrial Revolution. And one of the key thinkers on industrialization and the urbanization of populations as well as factory work at the end of the 19th century was then Pope Leo XIII, who wrote an encyclical called Rerum Novarum on the conditions of labor in 1891. And responding, he was responding in that encyclical to the considerations of the ever expanding workday, the ever younger children who were being pulled to work in the mills, in the factories, in a range of environments, the lack of rest time for families and individual workers. And as many of you probably know, it was Rerum Novarum in 1891 that began the tradition of Catholic social teaching. Now, Catholic social and ecological teaching, thanks to John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and the late Pope Francis. It is also, therefore, I think, no accident, and he has said this himself, that current Pope Leo XIV chose his name as an homage to Leo XIII because of the ways in which technologies and the questions of human powers, as well as, sorry, the questions of how the products of human creativity, technological power, is being deployed in the current moment, alongside all these realities of labor, political economy, and other relations. So Leo the 14th has been very explicit about this, and I think we will see in the future a lot more reflection from the Vatican on these topics. Technology is not necessarily neutral. And again, technologies only function within the frameworks that they are originated and deployed. To that end, in Laudato Si', Pope Francis talked about the technocratic paradigm. And the technocratic paradigm is a term that has a pretty negative valence. It is something of which to be skeptical, and it is something to avoid. Now, I'm not quoting Francis here. This is my summary. The technocratic paradigm is an overconfidence in technological solutions and market or economic forces together to solve complex social ecological problems. Francis wanted us, and this is from Laudato Si', and then he doubles down on it in Laudate Deum, to remember that these are human problems. They are questions of the caliber of our relationships, and to outsource those to new technologies that are developed in situations of social inequality, we need to be very, very careful because technologies and economies are not human-centered unless we make them that way. And so that's one of the lessons I want to begin by bringing out. Here are what I am calling some technocratic falsehoods. I think that one of the things I'm beginning to notice is that for younger generations, and for many in my own generation and above, there's an idea that AI is inevitable. And by AI in this talk, I mean generative AI. I'm not arguing with the development of computer science and artificial intelligence and, various models of circuits and based on neural networks and that sort of thing, but I'm talking about generative AI. Um, there is this idea that generative AI is inevitable. Now, generative AI is very prominent. It is happening and will continue to happen in many places. It is not, however, yet an entity that exists outside of human control, governmental, institutional, or individual. And so this is the moment in which, at all those levels of scale, we need to be thinking about what the guardrails are for this technology. Another technocratic falsehood, is that AI is neutral. This gets back to the Chris Hemsworth Amazon Alexa ad, which by positing the extreme absurd case that AI is super negative because it's out to kill Hemsworth, especially, um, that, oh, that's so silly, that's so ridiculous. It's actually kind of a neutral, good, benevolent entity. As we will talk about, it can be used for neutral purposes. We've already seen it can be used for really negative outcomes that violate sanctity of life and human dignity and a range of things. But what we have not seen, and what certainly was not on the air on display in the Amazon Alexa ad during the Super Bowl, was all of the inputs that go to creating the conditions of generative AI and wealthy people in the minority world, the white world that I, embody and live in. There is so much that is invisibilized. So one of the goals of this talk is to help make the invisible visible. Similarly, it is a falsehood that AI will benefit everyone, certainly not equally, and it does not benefit everyone, as we'll talk about shortly. And then another falsehood that AI will help solve major environmental crises. It may help. It may help us think through certain kinds of options. It may help with monitoring. I'll say more about that in a minute. But I do just want to underscore in a conceptual way that many times the claims about AI are rhetorically inflated to manufacture demand and generate profit. Um, Often the protocols are untested. The models carry a significant amount of racial and gender bias, and the social and environmental costs are enormous. And yet, there are huge enterprises that are for profit, oriented around promoting AI as an efficiency tool for busy moms, as an educational solution, and as a therapeutic alternative to real human conversation. And it's all built upon an infrastructure of extraction, both of human labor and of environmental goods. So, not great. In case you were wondering, yes, this talk is actually going to get to the environment specifically. And the way we're going to do that is by talking about where the raw materials and inputs come from. Some of those are offshored. They are both extractive in terms of minerals and the rare earth minerals and a range of other things that are required to power the green economy or the tech economy or the technosphere. They're also exploitative, which is a term that scholars use to refer to labor and social conditions in particular. Without getting too much into this, I do recommend a 12 minutes special that was done by the TV show 60 Minutes on how LLMs are generated and programmed and how the human labor, the human inputs that go into creating those LLMs as they go through and code all sorts of different kinds of internet data, videos, and so forth. It's a pretty grueling video. The human effects of it are very real, and I would commend that and a number of other things to you. It is not neutral, and it really can be very harmful to the populations who are drawn into this kind of labor. Um, and so I think that, that's something that those of us in the United States don't see on a daily basis very much because the technology is just presented as here and obvious, but it is not neutral. And then, of course, ecologically, what we're going to talk about in particular are data centers. Now, data centers are all over the news in lots of ways, and we're going to dive into that specifically. One thing that I would encourage you to do is in your local news or in whatever news sources you follow, just see what's going on with data centers that may be built near you. We'll talk about some in the Great Lakes, Arizona, California. I was just in Colorado visiting family. There are a bunch in various areas there. And start noticing what's going on with these data centers, if there are any near you. All right, so that brings us to part two, ecological considerations. And I'm going to do this especially through the lens of water. The reason that I'm going to do this through the lens of water is that water is one of the things that I work on extensively. And I also think it's a very illuminating way of flowing with the ecological questions. It's also one of the biggest scarcity sites um, of the 21st century, and there is no substitute for water. So, where's the water going to go? Who gets to use it? For what reasons? And who says? Huge questions. This is a picture of a data center that was actually taken in 2009 when Microsoft let some reporters from CNET into a data center. So obviously, data centers are not new. They have existed for a while to power the internet, cloud computing, all this kind of stuff. What is specific about generative AI is that the demand for the power that and the abilities, the platforms that data centers generate is skyrocketing with generative AI. It uses massive more amounts of water and energy than before. So, nothing is demanding water and energy faster in the current economy than data centers, especially again in this era of generative AI. They've proliferated in the past 15 years and especially in the past five. There is no end in sight, and given the thirstiness of generative AI and its currently unregulated status in the US, corporations like Amazon, big tech companies, Nvidia, and others are building data centers and often receive massive tax breaks to do so while they also guzzle up the water and energy of a region, driving up the rates for domestic households and other smaller users. This is happening in places such as Arizona, Silicon Valley, rural Oregon, the Virginia suburbs, upstate New York, lots and lots of places. So again, I do want you to take a look and see if any of this is happening near you. Water. So data centers require a huge influx of clean, fresh, cooled water and constant energy to maintain those processes. Evaporative cooling is the method used to maintain an effective functioning temperature for data servers. This evaporative cooling, this is a consumptive use of water. What that means is that the water evaporated is not returned to the watershed in a meaningful way because it's evaporated. Journalist Felicity Beringer was writing in Stanford University's publication. It's called And the West. And she explains the water energy nexus of data centers this way. It's not just electricity that is needed by these centers, which are now growing to massive sizes to accommodate AI's computing demands. They need significant amounts of water to keep cool, and new ones will need more. The new computer chips that are designed to produce artificial intelligence, like NVIDIA's Blackwell chip, use far more electricity and therefore need more cooling than the older generation of chips. All told, these data centers and manufacturing facilities are reshaping local grids, plumbing, and politics. Energy grids, plumbing, politics, interwoven and in the US, in addition to the offshored social environmental costs mentioned previously. A 2025 report by the Alliance for the Great Lakes urges caution about AI data centers and the impacts on that region. The report demonstrates that data centers, this is a quote, data centers are not being transparent about their total water footprint from the early stages of proposed development. And they may not have systems in place to accurately measure water use because there is no requirement to do so. It's estimated that fewer than 1/3 of data centers are currently tracking water usage. End quote. And that's a report from the Alliance for the Great Lakes. And then one of my favorite water watchdog publications is called Circle of Blue. I commend that to all of you. Journalist Christian Thorsberg was writing in Circle of Blue, and he points out that the broader political economic landscape in the Trump administration has led to, and this is a quote from Thorsberg, a deluge of changes in environmental law, regulation, budgets, and environmental agency staffing that amount to a broad erosion of federal protections for the Great Lakes. State lawmakers and business executives generally celebrate an industrial transition of historic proportions, but little attention is being paid to the potential damage to the environment, especially to the region's vast reserves of clean, fresh water. And this sharply increases the region's vulnerability to water pollution, land degradation, economic disruption, and harm to human health. End quote. In addition, data centers bring little to no direct social benefit. Often they're proposed for areas close to urban poor neighborhoods, often highly racialized neighborhoods, neighborhoods that already experience substantial environmental racism. And unfortunately, there's evidence to demonstrate that in many cases, corporations and local governments, often, for example, city councils, come to agreements behind closed doors about rezoning areas in order to allow data centers to come in that impact local communities. So there's a number of examples of this that maybe we can go into in Q&A. But again, Circle of Blue is a really good source on this kind of thing, and there's increasing reports on data centers from Food and Water Watch and a number of others. So let's see. There's a lot to unpack here, and I'm going to try to summarize it in a coherent way. First and foremost, with zero federal regulation, indeed, with its opposite, federal incentive since January 2025, as well as, well, data centers are proliferating. They require a huge influx of clean, fresh water, as I mentioned. And unfortunately, this is also occurring at the exact same time that federal regulations for environmental protection are not just not being enforced, they are also being actively rolled back, as we are hearing is about to happen with regard to the greenhouse gas endangerment finding, which again is a topic we can talk about. So, for example, the Clean Water Act is being weakened by court decisions at several levels of the judiciary, while the staff and budget of the EPA have been gutted, and the EPA's leadership and remaining resources seem dedicated to intimate collaboration with fossil fuel and technology industries. There is, as a result, what one of my friends who works in tech calls a diabolical race to the bottom, in which states offer data centers and their parent corporations free rein over water resources with minimal to no accountability. Again, local residents are feeling the impacts as water and energy become more expensive, and they may possibly dry up in the future. So, from an ethical perspective, eco-social, ecological perspective, especially horrifying to me is the blank check of water that municipalities and states seem to be writing to manufacturing corporations and data centers. Like, where is the long-term thinking here, people? Where is the recognition that freshwater is an irreplaceable, non-substitutable entity that is not only a resource or something that is subject to commodity logic? Um, there are a lot of ways that we can think about ameliorating this, and I'll suggest some in a moment. Um, at present, many corporations can say that they are water neutral in their use, and this includes data centers, but this is a Trojan horse because the agreements that they come to often give those corporations, those data centers, near total legal license to draw massive amounts of water in the future at a highly reduced cost with little to no accountability. Again, a race to the bottom. So this does sound like catastrophe. To my mind, it is a bit. Um, and so as I think about catastrophe, I think about a lot of things. I think about the fact that this is not the first catastrophe to unfurl eco-socially. There are many civilizations and populations, including indigenous, Black, and Brown people in the United States and this continent and beyond, that have been subjected to cultural, ecological, and physical genocide. There are also lots of ways that historically our own society in the United States, in its relative youth, has realized that environmental resources and environmental goods need to be protected and has stepped back from the brink of ecological disaster. I would like that to be the case with generative AI from an eco-social perspective, and only our actions now and going forward will determine that. So in that sense, the theological part of my brain starts thinking about a cognate term for catastrophe, which is apocalypse. And for those of you who think theologically or know the Greek, apocalypse doesn't necessarily mean the final end of something, but it does mean an unveiling. And so, what I would invite all of us to do is consider this to be an unveiling, a moment of invitation to a clearer perception, to see the hidden costs and inequalities, and then to consider how to move forward. To that end, I am really thankful to be an author in a series that the first book was published in 2024 by Cynthia Mo Labida. It's called Building a Moral Economy: Pathways for People of Courage, published by Fortress Press. And there are 5 subsequent books in this series. Mine is one of them. It's called Water for All, and it comes out in October 2026. Yes, this is a shameless plug, but Maria told me I should do it, so here we are. But it's also very relevant because not only do I talk about generative AI, semiconductor manufacturing, data centers, and how societies decide about various kinds of uses for water, I also offer principled ways of thinking through how we should value water and what that looks like practically at multiple levels of scale. The other books in the series also talk about things like housing, climate, food, and overall, the series is trying to foreground equitable economies, ecological integrity, and democratic processes. And I really love the way that Cynthia Mo articulates those three as interwoven, because I think that is also very much in keeping with what Pope Francis and now Pope Leo XIV have been moving towards in their language of eco-social degradation. Everything is connected, and the need for equity, for ecological integrity, and for democratic processes. Now, I also think there is an unholy trinity, and we can just move through all of these. This slide, actually, I should have put a little bit earlier, but the unholy trinity is data centers, their uninterrupted thirst, states race to the bottom, and federal incentive without regulation. So we'll go to the next one. All right, so let's get to the constructive stuff. Um, I was listening to a great podcast that just started last July. It's called Better Future with Michael Mezzatesta. It's a very interesting take on the current moment and the ways that political economy, ecology, and social movements intersect. On the very first launch episode in summer 2025, Michael Mezzatesta interviewed Aru Shini-Ajay, and she is the executive director of the Sunrise Movement. There's a lot that she has to say that's really interesting. Great conversations. Honestly, every episode I've listened to has been fantastic. But she said this phrase that really has stuck with me for some time, and that is the idea of transformative repolarization. So Shinya Jay said, there's so much resistance to the idea of polarization now and so much fear about what that means. And yes, the United States is highly polarized. Increasingly, other parts of the world are. The international order is facing challenges that it has not faced in centuries. And yet, she said, there are also ways that a transformative repolarization is happening. What does that mean? She explained that it meant that instead of a polarization in the kind of model of the American duopoly of a two-party system, the polarization is beginning to happen on economic terms. The 1% or the billionaires and those who have to labor to create capital that goes to profit certain enterprises, but not stakeholders. And I've been thinking about this in the context of AI because I have friends who are working on education and AI, from librarian at an elementary school to parent of three students in the New York public school system, who are indicating that across political spectrums, parents and other advocates are concerned about the ways that AI, generative AI, is having negative effects on the social and moral formation of children. And that is a conversation opener for other kinds of reconsideration of the technology. So I invite you to think about the idea of transformative repolarization. When we begin to see some of these infrastructural elements, how does that shift the terrain of coalitions that can be formed to work for better eco-social guardrails? So one of the ways this takes to the form is this is a phrase from my friend Kelly Clancy, PhD, the politics of refusal. Just what does it mean to say no? Um, One example is to advocate for human-centered education and keep AI out of K-12 public schools. This has been going on in New York City. There's a very strong set of, again, transformatively repolarized coalitions that are like, you know what? We need to learn more about what's going on here before we implement it. And maybe we need to ask teachers what they need. Um, there's also a number of essentially don't use AI movements in your individual life. One that I'll lift up is the People's Justice Council that has a minus AI campaign. Again, I link to that later in the slides, but you can also look that up on your own. And then a very specific kind of refusal, or at least a like, hey, let's slow our roll about this, is to get really specific about how to write municipal contracts for data centers. This is some of what I write about in Water for All. After reading a lot of the literature and thinking about how to do this, I'll move through these quickly. But for example, if you're in a community where this is impacting you, um, get some rigorous fixed constraints on the quantity of water that can be extracted from your system. Give priority and protection to domestic users and ecosystems so that the costs, literal economic costs, don't go up for those users, and also so that the negative externalities don't go up. Make sure that the data centers and the corporations have constant water use and quality reporting, monitoring with accountability, and also that the corporation, the data center, bears any cost of negative externalities. Negative externalities being things that might otherwise be borne by downstream users, but in this case, they would be fed back into the data center or the corporation. That all sounds very practical and social movementy. It is. So, taking a step back, where is this coming from? Well, again, because I am someone who's deeply schooled in Catholic social and ecological teaching, one way of thinking about it is that there are some really substantive ethical principles that help societies to move towards a common good, towards a long-term collective outcome of flourishing, instead of a more individualized, extractive idea of profit or success. It's not to say that profit or economies are bad, but again, that guardrails need to be in place so that we're not on a race to the bottom. Now, I'm taking this from an article by my friend and colleague Megan Clark. She teaches at St. John's University in Queens. And in an article, Development as Freedom, that is in conversation with the Amartya book by the same name, she's building on a framework about the common good from Professor David Hollenbach, SJ. And here are the principles. First, the needs of the poor take priority over the wants of the rich. So the needs of the poor take priority over the wants of the rich. How would that look like with regard to generative AI and the tech profits of our moment? Two, the freedom of the dominated takes priority over the liberty of the powerful. The freedom of the dominated takes priority over the liberty of the powerful. How would that look with regard to who decides where data centers go? Three, the participation of the marginalized takes priority over the preservation of an order that excludes them. What would it mean to begin asking the people whose lives are negatively impacted by, who bear the burdens of the infrastructures that support generative AI, and to say, you see things that we in the dominant minority world don't see. How should we proceed? And then fourth, sustaining creation and biodiversity takes priority over preserving, and I would add amplifying, established patterns of economic development. Guardrails, ethical guardrails from Catholic social teaching as articulated by David Hollenbach and Megan Clark. Now, oops, seems like I didn't edit that slide accurately. um, what I would like to, oh, I'm sorry, Matthew, just go back one. Um, the title there should say, plus the precautionary principle. So this is what I would add to this conversation as someone who's engaged in feminist science studies and also, again, shaped by Catholic social and ecological teaching. This is from Pope Francis in Laudato Si. What you're seeing at the top of your screen is actually a screenshot of the text of Laudato Si. And this is sections 186 to 187. The precautionary principle is an approach that has been advocated for scientific research in a number of domains for many years. So Pope Francis isn't making it up, but it is very useful that he is endorsing it. So he said in 2015 in Laudato Si, paragraph 187, wait, 86, sorry. Precautionary principle makes it possible to protect those who are most vulnerable and whose ability to defend their interests and to assemble incontrovertible evidence is limited. If objective information suggests that serious and irreversible damage may result, a project should be halted or modified. This does not mean, typo, being opposed to any technological innovations, but it does mean that profit cannot be the sole criterion. It's a fancy, nuanced way of saying slow your roll. Permanent, irreversible, serious, negative consequences are worthy reasons to adapt a stance of precaution and non-adoption until it can be known what the consequences will be. By contrast, right now in the United States, we are in an acceleration of a free-for-all without regard to the long-term consequences. And so those four principles from Clark and Hollenbach, plus the precautionary principle, I think are very, very useful ways to start thinking about this. Again, more promotion of where I think in different kinds of detail about these. Um, on the bottom is the book that I mentioned called Building a Moral Economy, Water for All. That's coming out in October. But then also very relevant to the talk of Laudato Si and Catholic social and ecological teaching is a book that I've written based on 10 years of engagement with and reflection on Laudato Si. That's called Beyond Laudato Si. Eco-theology, equitable futures, and the papal turn to the earth. And that will be out in June. And that is the cover that I'm really fond of. Um, so if anyone would like to continue these conversations, please do feel free to check those out when they come out. And I also very much welcome your feedback when you do have a chance to read them. Lots of brilliant humans to cite. There's a number of them here. Please feel free to take a screenshot or ask for the slides or go back and look at the YouTube video later. This is a list of human beings whom I've cited: Kelly Clancy, Ruha Benjamin, Abeba Berhane, Alondra Nelson, who I did not mention in detail, but she worked on the Biden administration era AI Bill of Rights, and that has since been shelved by the current Trump administration. But the idea of a Bill of Rights regarding AI and thinking about how this generative AI technology integrates with society is something that has been going on. And so I think looking to these kinds of leaders, even if not in the executive branch at the moment, is really important. And then Megan Clark, I mentioned also. In addition, there are some organizations and movements you might pay attention to. I mentioned Circle of Blue you can sign up for their weekly water news reporting, absolutely wonderful. There's also a wonderful journalist and writer named Jonathan Thompson who writes a Substack called The Land Desk that is about land and the West, and he's done some great work on data centers as well as fossil fuels. Um, I definitely recommend Food and Water Watch's Stop Data Centers Now campaign because there's a lot of information they have, as well as a number of ways of thinking about data centers and eco-social realities. The NAACP has launched a Stop Dirty Data Centers campaign specifically because of the ways that the data centers are often cited in or near economically marginalized and also racialized communities. And then I also mentioned the People's Justice Council and their Minus AI campaign. And that, my friends, concludes this talk. So I thank you for your attention over these 50 or so minutes, and I welcome questions and engagements that you might feel called to offer.
Um, Let me just see. Somebody, I don't know, Danielle Silverman or Google AI for general inquiries. I'm not sure if that is a question or She wants a comment from you. I'm
Oh,
not certain.
I bet Danielle, I'm guessing that might have been a response to that early
Oh,
little exercise I did. So yeah, I mean that's the thing, right? As Sister Maria pointed out at the beginning, there are so many ways that AI and now generative AI are being integrated into our daily lives. And so, like you open Google and boom, there's an AI summary. Now, there are settings that you can opt out of it on, but increasingly, the more, I get updates on certain kinds of software or programs, the more AI is built into it. And it takes a lot to unsubscribe, so to speak. And I find it to be worth the effort, but it's frustrating. And the ubiquity of it in apps, on platforms, and so forth does present it does seem to suggest that this is inevitable and this is just the way it's going. And sometimes, honestly, sometimes it is helpful, and other times I just find it really annoying. So thank you for
mhm.
pointing that out, Danielle.
Here's a question. Should AI companies be required to publicly disclose the full environmental footprint of training and deploying their models? And what standards would make that transparency meaningful?
Ooh. That's a fantastic question. I mean, I'm a big proponent of transparency, and I'm also a big proponent of environmental impact assessments and water footprints and so forth. So I would say in an ideal world or an ideal public policy, yes, yes, full disclosure should be great. I would actually say that for the fossil fuel industry too. What chemicals are going into the fracking solutions but all of these are regarded, or with regard to fossil fuels, though those are regarded as trade secrets. With regard to data centers, I think that this is why I suggest that municipalities, when they're working towards better forms of contracts and trying to avoid the race to the bottom, say, there needs to be really clear monitoring and reporting and accountability because this whole like, oh, this is going to be great, it's totally sustainable. What? Sustainability can mean anything, right? The problem of greenwashing is rampant. So show me what it means. Get specific. And I think that's one of the invitations of this talk and this series is to help us think about AI not as some abstract question, though of course it raises huge philosophical social questions, but also to think about the very real particular thing. So I love the idea. Like, yes, have corporations disclose their water footprint and so forth.
Yeah. This is Eleanor. Can you address the contract that the Vatican has established regarding AI that some tech companies and others have signed on to?
I think that, so I don't know the details about this, and you have reminded me that I need to go read it in greater detail. Um, I've been finishing the Water for All book, and so have been really immersed in it. I just sent it off 48 hours ago, actually. So I do need to bring myself up to date on this. I know that Paul Schurtz and others are deeply
Right.
involved in that kind of advocacy, and I'm so thankful for that. I think that one of the functions that the Vatican can really importantly serve in this moment is as a kind of moral voice on what ethical business leadership looks like. And of course, that's voluntary. Like the United Nations, it is not, well, actually, I don't need to make that comparison. We'll just talk about the Vatican. It's voluntary and it's a form of voluntary association, but it is a way that can elevate the standards and the profile and the social capital of those entities that want to sign on. So, do I think it's going to solve everything? No. But do I think it's a fantastic step forward? Yes. And I do also think that there is real need in this moment for thoughtful global leadership and models of what it means to be a corporation that is willing to take the common good into account, not just shareholder profit. Thank you
Mhm.
for that question.
Any other questions? I guess the question I would have for you myself is, in listening to Megan Clark and the principles and the precautionary principle, and I know about the contract, IBM, I think, is heavily involved in that. But I mean, when you consider what you told us tonight about what is going on across the country, um, I read an article in the New York Times, no, within the last 6 months about a family in Georgia who just had sludge in their appliances,
Mm.
and they didn't understand why. But there was a data center being built not far from their home, and the water was just being sucked out of the land, and they were left with the sludge. So I guess when I think about all of the implications, I wonder, like, how does Catholic social teaching get to the city councils and the boards
Yeah.
and the corporate tables? I mean, I don't want to sound too pessimistic, but I'm quite pessimistic, actually. I'm sorry to say it about this because, I mean, I think it's frightening. I mean, if you've ever lived in a place, if you go down to the Dead Sea now and you look at the evaporation of water down there, which has nothing to do with data centers, but just natural processes, and you see what happens to the land and the sinkholes. I mean, we can't possibly live without water, and nobody is putting uh, constraints on these corporations that are doing this, that are greedy and don't care about us. And I don't know, sometimes I feel like we live in a parallel universe of Catholic social teaching and ideas about the common good. But how is it impacting? I mean, have you seen in your life, in your experience, I mean, have you seen positive impacts? Where, or cite one where you say that really hit a home run in there and stopped X from doing Y?
Yeah, that's a great question. And a number of, I don't have answers, but I
Okay,
have gestures. And I would invite everyone who's on the webinar to think about Sister Maria's question in your context, because I think there are approaches that a number of social movements have that align with Catholic social and ecological teaching, but perhaps with different histories and motivations. So, a number of a number of proposed data centers have been slowed in some parts of Chicago, in some other parts of the Great Lakes because of these concerns and because of the coalitions that can come about from folks who've historically been interested in water conservation and folks who are concerned about social impacts and environmental racism, and folks who are concerned about economic opportunity or corporate opportunism. I live in New York City, and so we're in a very interesting political moment. Ecological questions are not at the forefront, but because, this is my pop psychology analysis as well as a little bit of social political movement analysis. But because people live in such close proximity to one another and to the resources, and we all experience when the pipes freeze in a building, they freeze for a whole lot of people at once, right? So
right.
the infrastructure can become visible to a collective in certain ways. And when the momentum hits a tipping point of enough people being aware, really interesting things happen. So, for example, a number of councils, educational councils, and organizations in the realm of New York City public education, um, the Department of Ed was considering like $12 million contracts with one or two AI companies. And those have been functionally stopped two or three times in the last year by people saying, you know what, not sure that this makes sense. And they're coming at it, from sometimes different reasons, but with a shared, let's slow the roll concern.
Okay.
And that, I think that while that is not exactly the same as opposition to a data center or trying to get people to think about water centrally, it is a proof of concept. And it does feel to me like, like you pointed out about the story in the New York Times, people can't live without water.
Right.
Whether one is on a farm and your animals can't survive because of the toxic water or because there's just simply not enough, or whether you are in a housing development that, suddenly the water is not there in the same way, whether your water is being turned off as it was in 2014 in often racialized domestic units by the City of Detroit Water and Sewerage Administration. Um, there is no substitute for fresh water. So if we are going to come together around anything, this seems like a pretty good one. So I
Got it.
think there is a lot of human creativity and awareness that we are seeing. And I have hope in that.
Thank you. I'm glad to hear it. Robert Redmond asks, do you feel that there is movement in the right direction by the U.S. Catholic bishops? They have recently spoken out about immigration enforcement and human dignity. Do they have a voice that will carry to local parishes and make a difference? I'm assuming on this topic.
Yeah, that is such a great question. I mean, this question of what difference do the bishops' councils in, or bishops' conferences rather, sorry, in any given region make? I think there is a real impact because if we just take the United States, obviously for a long time, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops has been very focused on abortion as its primary slash exclusive issue, right? And as someone who, me, works on water and the ways that the Vatican has turned to water as a human right and as a right to life issue and as fundamental to the fulfillment of all other human rights, I've been frustrated for a while at the narrowing of what counts as a life issue. Obviously, for a lot of people right now, immigration is a life issue, life and death issue in so many ways. Um, and I think it's a good thing that the bishops have made some movements on that. Um, would I love to see other entities that are Catholic also taking up that call? Yes. Um, will individual priests feel freer to preach their conscience on some of these topics now that the bishops have issued this statement? One hopes so. Um, I think also looking into if we turn the lens to water a little bit, looking into, I've got two thoughts on this. One is looking into the past. Around the turn of the century, the Catholic bishops of the Columbia watershed region issued a letter that talked about the Columbia River and the value of water. And this was one of the first documents to think about an ecoregion instead of a nation state kind of designation. So being able to think in ecoregion watershed ways is something really interesting that churches could consider banding together to do. The second, and perhaps given the time, final thing I'll say is that the climate and environment reporter Emily Atkin, she writes a climate journalist publication called Heated, wrote a reflection after the deaths of Renee Good and Alex Preddy. And she said, it's hard for me to know what to do in this moment when so much is going on with regard to immigration, devaluation of human life, lack of accountability, rule of law. What even does my work matter? And then she kind of wrote herself to a realization that, oh, right. These dynamics, everything is connected, as Pope Francis might have said in Laudato Si, or were he here to speak today. That these disenfranchisements, these violations, are all part of a same logic of domination that takes inputs of human life or ecological flourishing into its giant maw and tries to transform it into forms of capital that are then unevenly shared and disproportionately burdensome while benefiting only a very narrow segment of population. So everything is connected. Everything is not always connected in the same way, but how to disambiguate and honor those connections and come together towards a vision of flourishing is the question.
Mhm. And Christiana, there's just one more. We have time for 1 minute for this question. I think you can probably answer it rather quickly. Can the church appoint clergy to boards of AI corporations to share their input and concerns as leverage against the greedy powers of the corporations?
I mean, sure. That would be great. I love
Mhm,
that. Yes. Suggest that to the Vatican Commission.
mhm. Well, on that upbeat note, I want to end tonight at 8:15. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us, for instructing us, for bringing insights and observations I think that we will carry with us for a long time as we think about the world around us. Data centers. I was thinking, I hope there are none on Long Island where I live, but there may be, I don't know. And the importance of water all throughout Scripture. Also, without it, we just cannot live. So
Yep.
hopefully, in in through our prayer, through our concern, and our activism, we can work together to protect the common good and make sure that there's water and life for everyone. So I thank you so much. Safe travels to Ireland. Remember us as you're in the Emerald Island drinking a pint of Guinness. Take it easy. Good night,
Will do.
everybody. Good
Good night,
night.
everyone.
Oh,
Thank you.
everybody, the last webinar will be on February 25th. That's Michael Goodday, who's going to kind of wrap up the entire webinar, talk about the miracles, the menaces, and, the good and the bad of AI. And that is going to be live from St. John's University. Matthew is coming in from the West Coast. We'll be giving a presentation at St. John's University, and it's going to be live streamed to everybody else. But if you are in Jamaica, Queens, please come. It's going to be in the chapel on the St. John's University campus. And then after that, we have two mini courses. Sandra Schneiders is going to come and do a course for us on the resurrection in John's Gospel. And one of uh, uh, Christiana's colleagues at Fordham at Rose Hill campus will do part two of his course on Buddhism and enlightenment. So please stay tuned. Welcome back next time on the 25th as we wrap up this webinar. Once again, good night and God bless everyone. Thank you. Thanks, Christiana. Ciao.